right, welcome everyone to episode 28 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I'm your host, of course, Janice Case. Can I just say that, I want to mark this, that we're almost a year into this podcast, and I'm really just pleased with being able to stick to it and actually having recorded and posted. Today will be 28 episodes because you just never know what's going to happen when you start something like this. And I'm just really pleased that we're still here. So don't get me wrong. I'm actually really looking forward to taking the next step to get this podcast on a larger platform. But the good news about 28 episodes and even the several we've done around the kind of topic in the book that we're talking about right now allows us a chance to do that and have a decent library of episodes from which to start. That would not be possible, by the way, if it hadn't been for all the really amazing folks who tolerated interviews with me over the last year. Two of them, of course, are right here and have stuck with me today, Melissa Ellis and Henri Williams, and frankly, are the reason that the momentum is continuing around this line of thinking and around really having some tough conversations around race. So 10 months ago, and again, I'm just kind of refreshing our listeners, you guys know that 10 months ago, our focus in this podcast shifted to race specifically. And since then, we've worked to bring you real conversations about how to be part of the solution around racial inequities in this country. One concerted effort we made is to continue to inform our own thinking, which we talked about way back last summer as one of the keys to our trying to actually make progress on the front of race, if you will. That idea of seeking to understand and how important that would be. And we've been doing our research to bring facts to the conversation and reality to the conversation. So to that end, of course, starting this year, we decided to inform our own thinking by reading Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And if you're joining us for the first time in a while, then you're going to want to go back, right? You're going to want to go back to episode 25, pick up the conversation and the thread there, and then move your way forward in order to jump into where we are now. That's going to be your ideal. Today, we're going to continue that conversation by exploring the idea of ethnicity as put forth in Kendi's book. But first, let's turn to our contributors, Melissa and Henri. That's kind of where we are, right? I wanted to set the stage, and again, I really can't thank both of you enough for just continuing to show up, because it's not like we have a budget, right? Nobody's paying you. You're doing this out of your own kind of selfless community service, if you will, be a part of the solution mindsets, if you will, and I really value that. And I was reminded, Henri, when you shared two recent news items with us, that it might be helpful to be sure we use this time to discuss race in terms of what's happening right now, right? I mean, obviously, Kendi does both. He does a historical look at and then the current, but stuff that's really happening right now. So I'd like to start today by going back to a text you sent us last week about a story out of Oklahoma. And it was the 13-year-old young man who had an encounter with a racist white teacher. So if you don't mind starting us off by giving us a quick overview so that we discuss that, because I'm interested in seeing how we can connect that to some of the learning around Kendi up thus far in our conversations. Does that sound good? And if so, then the floor is yours, friend.
Oh, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Just to make a little quick thought.
Please.
I'm glad that I can do these in my bathrobe.
Now everyone has a visual. Thank you, Henri.
Because I'm just not one of those early risers, Rest and be ready.
I love it.
A couple quick thoughts. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I went back to chapter 3 for a moment. Not chapter 3, the previous chapter, discussion of biology.
Yeah.
And if my memory is correct, he begins the discussion talking about a third grade experience.
Yeah.
And he ends the discussion talking about that third grade experience.
Yep.
And as I reread the chapter, so to speak, I came away and I thought to myself, it's interesting how he, let's just say, booked, those,
yes.
That chapter with that story, because the more I thought about it, I didn't see a true correlation.
Okay.
Versus what I came away with was that really so much about biology, body versus expectation based on what the teachers saw,
Yes.
in terms of a Black kid versus a white
Yes.
kid. And I just thought, all right, maybe it was a convenient way for him to get in his third grade story,
Right, of course.
but I did see the significance of what he was saying.
Yes.
And, maybe it wasn't so much about body biology versus expectation.
Right.
Teachers, educators may have just in terms of who they see in the class.
Sure.
And perceptions around that.
Yeah.
But I just thought about that. I said, that's kind of interesting. But going forward, so in terms of this 13-year-old, the way I understand the story, and I read a little bit, he comes to class. Apparently it was a science class. They were going over the table of elements. And his mother had bought him a T-shirt for his birthday, which said Black King, I believe.
Yeah. Yep.
On a map of Africa. And basically it was honoring, the history of kings, who were from Africa.
Yeah.
And this was a gift. And he wanted to wear it to school like any other 13-year-old would want to wear a great gift from their mom on their birthdays.
Right.
Well, apparently the teacher stops the discussion and makes reference to his T-shirt. And apparently it falls along the lines of she calls his T-shirt racist, makes reference to the need for a White History Month,
right?
As opposed to, is there truly a need for Black History Month? Him, to his credit, basically said to her, yes, we do. We don't have enough Black history taught as it is. What he didn't say was that white history is taught every month. I don't see a need for that to be specialized.
Yeah.
And then what kind of took me aback, but did not surprise me based on having my own personal experience with school districts, school boards, and actually filing a federal suit, of discrimination, was the school's response. And the school's response kind of, to me, was trying to take a halfway step, well, maybe she was inappropriate or shouldn't have done this. But I don't feel they truly addressed the issue in the way that it should have been addressed in terms of what occurred. To include, if my memory is correct, and correctly, if you may have seen the article, the teacher went on to carry on a discussion within the class where she got other classmates to co-opt her position.
Yeah. And
start to also tell this youth that somehow his T-shirt was racist. Yeah.
Yeah. So fostering that misconception, you know what it made me think about? I think, agreed, that the district, of course, took the very cautious, repeat our policy, here's our policy, we don't tolerate yada, 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 but not necessarily, and who knows, and investigating. So who knows what that means or when that will end, but whether or not this was a violation, right? Is it a violation of our policy of not tolerating, racist or, discriminatory, et cetera. But it made me go back to, Kendi's book and the idea of definitions, right? From the beginning, about how important those are, because it was fascinating to me that this white teacher thought that his wearing a shirt that said Black Kings was racist. Actually, she didn't say his shirt was racist. She said, if I wore a shirt that said White Queens, that would be considered racist. So essentially, then it was, so why can you wear a shirt that says Black Kings, right? So which in and of itself is a really interesting dynamic that in her head, because what she's done in her head, in my mind, is put them on equal footing. And of course, part of the definition that he talks about when he talks about what it means to be racist is, of course, he ties it to policy like he does consistently, but one who's supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. So it's interesting to me that in her head, by identifying my race, I'm racist, right? Like if I identify my race, I'm racist. Like, and so it's just a really powerful example of the common everyday misconceptions that exist.
Well, how about also just the lack of information?
Agreed.
Because I heard an interesting counter. If she had wore a T-shirt that said Queen Victoria,
right,
where there actually was queens, yes, there's nothing racist with that.
Of course,
Queen Elizabeth II, you could wear a T-shirt like that.
Yeah.
There were kings in Africa.
Exactly.
There was a picture of Africa, you know, and you know, so no, there would be nothing wrong with her wearing a T-shirt that respected or honored a genuine queen that existed.
Exactly. Exactly. That's it. That's it. Melissa, did you want to jump in?
Well, I just think it's important to let's not forget the historical aspect of all of it either, which is what I've found that a lot of people do when spouting racist ideology. For example, when you have taken an entire group of people, Black men specifically, and not to exclude Black women, but we're speaking about a young Black boy right now, Black men specifically, and told them that they are nothing, which is what has happened consistently from the beginning of history, you know, from slavery forward, told them that they are nothing. And then they decide that, no, we're not going to buy into that and believe that anymore. We're going to teach our children that they are just as important, that they can be kings, that they are powerful, which is what his statement was truly saying. I'm a Black king, I'm a king. To uplift himself, to uplift his peers. If you're not looking at the history behind that, then of course you think that was racist. Which is part of the problem. We never want to accept what we have done to Black people in this country. That's the heart of the issue right there. We want to sweep it under the rug. We want to forget it ever happened. We want to pretend like, oh, you guys have always been treated fine. You know, slaves were happy. They liked being slaves. They were well treated when they weren't being whipped and raped and tortured. And you know, so there's a lot of that behind it. It's easy to look at something today and say, oh, that's not fair. But nothing we do today is completely separated from the entire history of this country. And that's where I think, you know, a big part of it lies. But the part that bothers me just as much, I won't say more than, but just as much, is her lack of professionalism. This was a grown woman, an educated teacher, arguing with a teenage boy. She then brought his classmates into that argument to demean and embarrass him, and expected him to be able to defend something at the age of 13, I think he was, against her, a college educated woman. And for the school to pretend that that was okay because maybe it didn't break a policy is disgusting to me. If I were his mother, she'd be having that conversation with me. Because that would be her equal footing, not a child. So there's all of that, but that feeds into as well, and we're going to get into this, I think, more in the body. I haven't read it yet, so I'm guessing, but my understanding of the body part of it as well, that plays into as well this idea that Black boys and Black girls are seen as grown or adult a whole lot faster than white children are seen. And so she felt perfectly fine having an argument, which I'm sure she categorized as a debate, but at any rate, you did that to a child, which is something that in some people's minds, you know, they don't see them as children simply because their bodies might look bigger or whatever the foolishness is behind it. But all of that plays into this, which is why this is such a classic case that fits this very topic and fits the next one as well. But it's all of that for me, and it angers me. It absolutely angers me. It angers me as a mother. It angers me as a Black woman. It angers me as an adult. As a, you know, I would have had quite a conversation with said teacher.
Well, and that's what I mean, those are the pieces we don't know, but we can hope for. And so I think, you know, what I value about what you're saying is that it's, there's a missed opportunity here, right? If this district in this, or at least at the school level, if this principal doesn't take this opportunity to say, okay, we clearly have some misconceptions, and so we're going to spend some time on that, and not just have somebody come in and tell them why it's wrong, but importantly, Melissa, to your point, explore the history a little bit to show them how it's wrong, right? Because I think you're right. I think we don't go back enough to the history. We just go to our emotional response. And because we don't have the historical backing, which is one of the things I value about this book that we're looking at together, we don't really have the arguments ready. We just tell how we feel. Henri, go ahead. I know you wanted to jump in.
Oh, no. You know, I was listening to Melissa, and you know, it's kind of funny in a way. And yes, I probably get angry, but I'm kind of beyond angry in a way.
Yeah.
And this may sound funny to you, and it kind of reminds me of something he said in the book. Not all white teachers are racist, and we should call this what it was. This was a teacher who was white who acted racist.
Exactly.
You know, and what to me is the bigger issue is the greater school policy.
Yes.
All right. I do not expect all white teachers to not behave in the way that she behaved. I mean, we know that there are teachers who believe those things. Absolutely. Who, given an opportunity or whatever circumstance, will do what she did. All right. And those are individual teachers behaving as racist in a public arena. To me, what is the biggest and the bigger issue is what is this policy of the school that requires and enforces the behavior of teachers, and where is the accountability? And I'll give you an example of this. So as I've mentioned before, I've dealt with this personally, and the accountability to me is you file a lawsuit. I recently attended 3 local school board meetings of the local district I am in. Last week, they had their general school board meeting. A portion of the meeting was talking about implementing the new equity policy, equity, transparent. The stimulated discussion that brought up, you know, just really took me aback. You know, for one, and I literally had a discussion with the superintendent about this. And I said, how can you want to bring forth a policy and a curriculum to talk about racial justice that doesn't include the community, that doesn't include the persons affected by the injustices that you are trying to undo?
Right.
And this was all couched with, well, the district school board policy does not allow for the public or the parents to be involved in these meetings, although you can ask a question when general meetings occur.
Right.
You know, and so I'm sitting on in this meeting, and, you know, and I said, so you're asking us public and parents to trust the elected school boards, given what various differences they may have in their expertise or experience, to represent us and to represent our needs. And as I'm watching this, I'm like, oh my goodness, this just does not work, because, you know, as I just said, here we're talking about wanting to bring forth racial justice policies. I'm looking at a school board that's all white.
So, Henri, what you just pointed out is like that is such a powerful point for you, because who thinks about that when are your boards elected or appointed?
They're elected.
Okay, so when you're standing there at the poll, right, and you're actually going to mark who you're choosing, who thinks about that, right? And who thinks as a voter to ask the candidates, so if the school were to begin to devise an equity policy, who would you include in the conversation? So I love that you said that, because that's opening doors, I feel like, for our listeners to go, oh, this is how I have to pay attention. This is how I influence the policy that actually significantly influences all of us. Go ahead, Melissa.
And I was going to say, not only when you say who thinks about that, you know, but where is it ever? Because I mean, I think we have to keep in mind, as we've stressed over and over in these communications, that not everybody's at the same level.
Yeah.
So when you have parents who are working full-time jobs, who are single parents, or who are struggling, or like, where do they even have the opportunity to ask those questions of potential candidates, because that's not something that's advertised. That's not something that is common knowledge. That's not something that is something that someone who's not already active in a community would know. And yes, ideally, we'd all be active. Ideally, we'd all know exactly, but that's not reality.
Yeah.
I also wanted to stress that I hear Henri completely about the policy part, but I want to be very clear that that's part of the anger. Yeah. Part of the anger is that here we are in 2021, which is where this happened, and a school can still say, well, it doesn't really go against our policy, but we're going to look into it. Like, right. The fact that those policies are still in place, and I get that, you know, we have an ability to change that, which is what I hope we're kind of doing with this podcast, is showing people that they have an input, showing people that they have a voice. But that's all part of the anger for me. It's not just this one teacher that I'm angry at. She's one person, absolutely one person. It's the collective, which is what we keep talking about. It's the collective. It's the fact that here we are in 2021, still having to deal with these same issues, which are backed by policy. It's infuriating.
So Ty, what you just said about the 13-year-old to Henri, though, because what Henri is getting at is in his local board, right? They're doing what a lot of boards are doing, which is establishing equity policies and looking at justice or curriculum around racial equity and justice. And the fact is, and Henri's pointing this out, I'm going to come back to you, Henri, is that they're doing it in a way that's so isolated from the community that it actually impacts. There's some policy there that needs to be changed, right? The fact that you can only give input at a board meeting makes no sense. Yeah,
absolutely. Which is kind of my point, is the fact that such a policy is in place, like, it's common. It should be. I'm not going to say it is. It should be common sense that if you're going to have a discussion about racial equity, that there needs to be equal representation in that conversation. I don't think anybody sitting on that board is dumb enough, and if they are, shame on them, is dumb enough to think that that's okay. Yeah. It's not that it's okay. It's that it's convenient. It's that they've gotten away with it. It's that they can. Yes. And that's where the frustration comes in at too, because again, when you're talking about it, and I don't know the community that Henri's in, I don't know whether these are, you know, middle class or, you know, I have no idea. But for a lot of schools where there needs to be these kinds of conversations about racial equity, you're dealing with lots of low-income families. You may be dealing with immigrant families who don't know that this is the case, who don't know that they need to have that, they need to speak up and make that change. So again, it's because it's convenient, it's because they can get away with it, it's because it looks good to say we're going to have this conversation, but nothing ever changes. And that's that's the frustration.
Yeah.
You know, yes and no. You know, because I know that there are differences in people's ability to access. And, you know, in fact, one of the things, I had a recent discussion in our community meeting, and one of the things people said is the pandemic has actually created opportunity.
Yes.
And because you don't have to get in a car and drive to a meeting, we have seen more involvement and seen more opportunity for involvement that doesn't really tax your time in a way that it used to. Those of us, myself included, who do have the time, and I, you know, I don't want to suggest don't be angry. You know, it's just, for me, my history of anger had to move to and do about it, you know, because I couldn't just sit there with the feelings. And so one of the things we've done, some of us have done, is we have the ability, because we do maybe have the time in these meetings, is, they bring about a policy or some change. And one of the questions I ask is, okay, that's nice. How do you plan to implement and inform?
Right.
Going back to what you're saying, Melissa, not everybody has internet or smartphones. And so the idea is, assuming, maybe that's a bad way to do this, there are those of us who aren't savvy, who don't have time.
Sure.
And so one of the things I always talk about in any of these meetings or community organizations that I'm involved in is, whatever you're doing, let's look at every person at every point on the spectrum and think about, how are they informed? How are they not brought into this knowledge base?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm talking about, getting involved with these school board meetings is, this is all well and good, but where's the parent and the community involvement?
Right.
And somebody even brought up this idea, and I immediately shot back, well, not everybody has smartphones, not everybody, and my community, just to share this, is we go from very wealthy to poor. Yeah. So it's kind of a good mix, but it has aspects of rural too. And when we just moved here about 2 years ago, they just put in high-speed internet. So there are areas, even in our district, where there are people who don't even have high-speed internet. So, going back to what you're saying, yeah, you can put all that stuff on the internet, but not everybody has access.
It's still an access issue. Yeah, that's exactly right. But I do think that and from my perch with the work that I do with districts, and of course all the research and work that we do around education in general, especially in response to the pandemic, I do think we're starting to see a slow realization, and it is painfully slow in some places, that it's not enough to say, well, we put it online. Well, offering it's not enough. That we actually have to take responsibility for people being able to access it. So I'm going to, go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying that was one of my main points when I said, not just single mothers, but that's the whole point, is that it's easy to just say, oh, well, we put it out there.
Yes.
But we didn't make sure people understood it. And even something as simple as, because we make a lot of assumptions, especially when we are amongst the educated. We make a lot of assumptions and we start to believe that, oh, well, they should just know that. Everybody should just know that they can speak at a school board meeting, or they can, not everybody knows.
Yes.
I would even venture to say a majority of people don't know.
Yeah.
And so because they don't know, does that mean that they just, well, we did our part, we put it out there? And that's where I think when I say that it's convenient, because it works, because they can, we don't, and that's the word I think I was missing, is access.
Yeah.
We don't ensure that everybody has access to that information.
And it is partly from an epiphany perspective. I will say this, one of the districts we're working with right now, we have a group of about 70 people, district people at all levels, community leaders of organizations, universities, parent representatives, et cetera. And of the parent representatives, there's a large group of them who are Spanish only speakers. So we have interpreters and all the things, right, to increase access. And one of the really big epiphanies in this district, where they have done a lot of work to provide access to parents, the messaging that they're getting loud and clear is still very much, I know you put it out there. I know you're saying I can go to this website, but what I'm telling you is, with our unique circumstances, we're not accessing it. And it's been really powerful to watch the superintendent and his team go, we have a lot of work to do. Like, that's on us, and we have a lot of work to do. So I'm going to transition us, if I can, because I want to make sure we talk at least in part about this next chapter from Kendi. And Henri, I'm going back to, well, now I can't remember which one of you said it, but the conversation just about the teacher and how the teacher handled this situation that she instigated in the classroom with this young boy. Because Kendi actually, in this chapter about ethnicity, he actually part of his storytelling is about his own experience as a college professor. Now, it's a different type of story because as the professor, he's not instigating something. But what he does is really model well for us what this teacher could have done, which is seek to understand, right? Which is rather than make a confrontational statement to this student, even in a way that's, oh, I'm just putting it out there. Is it possible that, using that kind of a method, if you will, instead of that, asking questions, right? What he did with his situation with his student, which we're not going to play out completely here, but when that student made a lot of assumptions and kind of racist statements about African Americans, instead of responding to them, he asked questions, right? He helped the student figure out where his biases and his information was coming from. And so I think there's a lesson to be learned there for schools and districts, right? How do you seek to understand, and how do you teach the adults who have that access to kids to seek to understand versus to allow their inherent kind of biases that are on the tip of their tongue to come out? So ethnicity is the focus, and it's going to become really clear to our listeners, I think, about why ethnicity, why he takes time around ethnicity. And this is kind of timely for me because I was just with a group of school leaders earlier this week. And one of the things that we completed together was an autoethnography. And so it's an exercise where you're kind of writing your own autobiography in a very succinct way, but specifically around certain areas. And some of them were socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, language, religion. And the idea is that the adult has to think about their story with that in mind. So what's my story socioeconomically, right? Did I start out in poverty? Did I start out and where am I now? But then we get to an exercise where you reflect on, okay, if that's your story, what are the strengths that story, kind of embeds in you? But what are the vulnerabilities, right? Where are some of the places where you're probably operating out of biases, et cetera, that are a result of your own experience? So when we jumped into ethnicity with him, I just thought, because the epiphanies people have when they go through that experience are really significant because they had no idea, right? Until they actually thought about it and wrote it down. They had no idea how much their journey was influencing some of the things that they do today. So let's dig in, and kind of like we've done before. I have my own notes where I kind of go, right through the chapter, but those are just in order to kind of track a conversation. So if you guys want, and Melissa, I think I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. But if you have one or two, or start with one kind of big idea that you took away from this chapter around ethnicity and why Kendi puts it in front of us, why it's important for him to help us think about ethnicity. Let's start there, and then I'm going to come, of course, to Henri.
Absolutely. I think that what a lot of people, it goes back to the idea of monoliths for me. Yeah. And I think that is huge. And I think that that's something that until people grasp that concept that we are not monoliths, regardless of what color our skin is, where we grew up, what home we came out of, until people grasp that, we're never going to really understand this whole issue of race. Yeah. The other part of it for me was that the idea that race is a social construct. He actually points out when it was developed and how. And so I think that is so important, because I think people will look at, if I'm standing next to Henri, they're going to see two Black people, and they're going to make assumptions that two Black people have this, they're Black, they're the same. We have the same likes. Henri and I could probably not be more different.
Right.
And we have a lot of similarities, yes, but just based on skin color or where we're both Americans, those things, that's the kind of stuff, like Henri's ethnicity is different from my own.
Sure.
Those things are things that people don't think about, people don't know, people don't consider. And I think that chapter kind of drove that home for me, even for myself. When you start to think about the fact that I grew up in the South. So me as a Black Southern woman, even though I didn't really consider it the South,
sure,
but most people in the world consider it the South, is going to be different from someone with a completely Northern experience, but it's also going to be different from someone with a deep South experience.
Right.
I moved from Virginia to South Carolina, and Blacks in Virginia are not the same as Blacks in South Carolina. So it was that for me. That's what I took away from it the most, I think, was the fact that whole idea of being monoliths, and it shatters. He shatters it, which it should be done. It should be shattered.
Well, and he really harkens us back from the very beginning. Like you said, he takes us to the history, and he takes us to the history that was fostered by slave traders and the misconceptions around ethnic traits, right? That even in that industry, it was, oh, slaves from this part of Africa are better than slaves from this part of Africa because of where they're from. And the ridiculousness, it tied back to the biology. When we think about all the ridiculous medical arguments that were made until 2000, and even some still since then, about why racially we're different, that of course now we know are debunked and aren't true. He does the same with that ethnicity, right? So because you're from this part of Africa and agriculture was something that you had to engage in to feed yourselves, you guys are going to be great slaves, right? But if you were over here where there was an abundance of food, you're going to be lazy. So I mean, just taking it back to there and realizing kind of what you said, that, and you said it at the beginning again, you said it before, that we did not bring slaves to America. We brought people, and they were from different regions of the world, and they had different cultures, et cetera, et cetera. Henri, go ahead.
Well, kind of what you were just saying is, and he references this towards the end of the chapter, it's about culture, because there are the differences that you see within every culture is about the different cultural differences, So, for example, you don't do this monolithic, all Black people are the same. And in the chapter, he makes references to, and I like what he did, and this kind of came up in another meeting I was in, where the tendency to group too much together and not really look at the differentiation. And for example, I bet you if you subgroup white people and did like comparisons to the subgroupings of Black people, you would see not many differences if you looked at it on a socioeconomic scale. And I would challenge anyone to say I'm wrong about that one. And he even makes reference to that in this chapter. Do we do fair comparison of similar groups? For example, do we group all Blacks, and then compare them, and effectively to whites, versus. And I kind of liked that piece where, he talks about, well, how come, immigrant Blacks, let's say, tend to do better than, African-American Blacks who have been here long, and somehow making the suggestion that supports, we've moved beyond racism. Well, that goes back to what I just said, not doing a good, fair comparison of the groups. Because if you looked at immigrant Blacks as they compare to whites in the same situation, they are still discriminated against. They are not doing as well, And if you want to look at why they may be different, it's about culture. And I can speak to that because, on my mom's side of the family, we're from the Caribbean, and my dad's side were the Southern mulattoes. And anything I remember from the time I could think, it was about education. I knew how to read before I went to kindergarten, that's culture. That has nothing to do with, Black people or certain Black people being better or different than anyone else. Given the opportunity, everyone could achieve those things. That's simply about culture. But that the thing that jumped out at me was this grouping and really doing correct and fair comparison of the right groups, other than this monolithic, everybody is the same kind of approach. And, and as a great example, even the early point of choosing Africans from different points on the continent, different African cultures were different. They rolled different, so to speak, and for some strange reason, these people who wanted to enslave them thought, well, this culture being more conducive to what we wanted to achieve over in America than that culture. Simply that. But I'll end on this. One of the things that, and he starts the chapter off with this, and it just resonated with me. And it really made me think, oh my God, this indoctrination that he talks about, does it become so subtle and ingrained? I do remember as a kid telling racial jokes.
Yeah.
And most of them were not becoming to me or my culture. And as I kind of explored this, it's that joke about, the white guy, this guy, and the black guy. And usually the joke would go along the lines of either, ha, 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 look how stupid the black guy was, or ha, 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 look at how he outsmarted these people based on the assumption that he didn't know anything to begin with. And we would all laugh and joke, and I certainly remember the distinguishing of ourselves within our own culture, within our own race of, oh, this one is better or different than that one. And I remember those things, I don't remember when they began, as if they were just always seemed to be there. And at some point I had to make a conscious decision to not do that anymore.
And absolutely. That journey is similar to his. Go ahead, Melissa.
Absolutely. That really hit home for me too, Henri, and hearing you say it even more so. I am of a lighter complexion. A lot of my family are, but we have some family members who are darker. And I remember being little kids, and the go-to insult for those darker family members was to insult their skin complexion. Blackie, ponderosa, which was to insinuate that they had been burnt like a steak. Those kinds of jokes. And it wasn't until adulthood, and like you said, a very conscious decision to say, I will not do that. I will not. But it's still something that's very pervasive in African-American culture. Colorism is very, very real. And that is not something that I think a lot of people stop to think about in how that's damaging within our own group, which we're talking about groupings, but that's very damaging. But that is something that we do, not just African Americans to Africans, but African Americans to African Americans. Like, it is a very real issue even today, which to me just drives home this whole idea that racist ideology is the very basis of life, the way we know it, in this country, globally. Like that is, and like you, Henri, I don't remember when it started. I think it was always just a part of my life, even because I remember being a little kid, like elementary school, making those kinds of jokes about people. So,
and remember too, Melissa, you and I grew up obviously in the same place, right? We grew up in Pennsylvania, and we've talked about how simple it was from the perspective of there were white, there were black, right?
Yep.
So part of what he's doing here is, I heard you say, I don't even know when it started, it just always was, because it's always been, right? So he actually leads us to this idea that that this is deliberate, right? That when all ethnic groups fall under the gaze and power of race makers, they become racialized, right? That intention is very deliberate, because if we can basically establish a culture where finding the group that's lower than you is something that we all seek, then we can continue to manifest the policies that keep certain groups down, et cetera. And he touches on it in, like you said, in the relationship of brown immigrants to African Americans. He talks about it in terms of Native Americans, how we Europeans identified these are the 5 civilized tribes, but everybody else are heinous and savages. And so we keep doing that to each other. So what you guys are really talking about is just the modern version of, but and in my mind, the answer is it's always been there. And the thing that the experience that I'm thinking about that was most telling for me on this front of ethnicity was, as a high school assistant principal, having 2 young ladies who were both Black. That's how the 2 Black young ladies, right? Not that that should matter, but who were constantly at odds with each other. I could not figure it out, but one just battle after another, and they eventually ended up in a physical confrontation. And when I finally did the investigation around that, and of course I learned a lot from that experience about understanding better earlier, but when I finally did the investigation, what I ultimately learned was they were both from different, and they used the word tribes in Africa that were warring in the current moment in time. We're at war with each other.
Wow.
And they were manifesting that war in the halls of our school. That for me was the first major wake-up call of, oh my gosh, like I knew they were from different countries. I knew that.
Right.
But I didn't understand the nature of that what that meant
They
for
do
them,
that,
right?
They do that in Appalachia.
Exactly. Yep.
So again, it's about something someone said earlier, history. It's not uncommon. They do it in America.
Yep.
You
That's
know,
exactly
it's
right.
just for some reason, oh, they don't do that. Those folks don't do those kind of things.
Yeah.
But something you and Melissa was talking about in terms of the disparities and the jokes, and I think he does this in a further chapter. I don't know so much in this chapter, was starting to literally quantify those differences, where through the use of data and looking at how, based on the tone of a person's skin,
yes,
will affect, let's say, what happens to you when you are in front of the judge.
Yeah.
For example, lighter skinned Black people tend to have a more favorable outcome in court than darker skinned Black people.
Yeah.
And lighter skinned people may have it easier, and I'm using words that may not completely fit, but let's just say an easier time in school than a darker skinned person. Or when applying for a job, a lighter skinned person may have it. And as he was saying that, I couldn't help myself but go back and think about myself. I am a lighter skin. And then I thought, even within my family, there are grades, because I'm lighter skinned. My sister's even lighter, and my dad passes. And based on those differences, I know for a fact, and I've often thought, that I have a different outcome in this situation than my friend Joe, who is very dark.
Absolutely.
And as I read this chapter, I started to think, yes, there's been a quantification of this, and to me, that kind of goes back to this anti-racism piece, because to me that is just so powerful. The whole idea of, we're talking about jokes, and we don't know when it began versus it always was. Somehow it just moves from generation to generation. And when we think about these things like this, and how people are perceived and treated, that's such a powerful thing. Is that also something that is just so ingrained that this goes on and on, unless someone literally has to make a conscious effort to think about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm glad you kind of centered us back there, and like you said, it's such a conscious thing, and you both have said you had to make the decision to be deliberate, right, about not thinking or engaging in, and I think that's really powerful for all of our listeners to hear, because we've said that before, but understanding that that's true for each one of us. I do want to make sure that I point out that he defines ethnic racism, and he kind of gives us a way to think about it as ethnic racism is when we express a racist idea about an ethnic group or support a racist policy toward an ethnic group. And he talks about the simple question of, where are you from? Mm-hmm. And the fact that in and of itself is an example of ethnic racism, especially depending on the motivation. And he gives his own example that because he is a college professor and a published writer, he often gets the question, where are you from? And his response is always Queens, New York. And when they press, no, where are you really from? No, I'm really from New York. Well, where are your parents from? All of that, he reminds us, is because the person asking doesn't believe that an African American could have gotten to where he has gotten.
That's
that
right.
He must be from somewhere else. He must be one of these more high-performing immigrants, right, that we talked about. And we're about to talk just really quickly about how he, helps us understand that where those myths come about immigrants being, brown people who are immigrants being better than, right, more highly valued, if you will, than African Americans. That in and of itself, I think, is something really important for people just to let sit and think about, right? When have you done that, and why, right? When you ask that question, why are you asking it, right? What is important? Where is it stemming from? Because when I read that part for him, I just thought, oh, wow, right? Like the underlying belief really is that you can't possibly have become a college professor or published writer unless you were from someplace else.
And that's a classic example of that term we've discussed before, of microaggressions.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because on face value, that question is so harmless. Oh, I just want to get to know you. Where are you from?
Innocent.
But it's the pressing, and it's the pressing on that issue when I say, the other version of that is, well, what are you mixed with?
Yeah.
Because you're so pretty. What are you mixed with? Or you have such pretty hair. What are you mixed with?
Yeah.
As if those things are, or even like when you hear someone speak intelligently, who you speak so articulately, which I get all the time, which drives me up the wall, because of course, an average Black person can't be articulate. An average Black person can't be beautiful, can't be smart, can't be, and I'm not even going to say that every single person who does it knows themselves what's driving it or what's behind it, because like we said, it's always been there. And it's until you actually start doing the work and educating yourself. And again, I keep coming back to, and I will forever come back to, the history. Until you understand that, you're never going to really understand why that's such a problem, why that's feeding into racist ideas, and how it's not anti-racist to think that way.
And it really is, in part, like I said, this idea of we have been cultivated to always look for the group who we can devalue, always look for the group that we can say, well, at least we're not them. And that's a part of what you're saying, Melissa, until we really seek to understand the history and understand that that really is a weapon, right? Used by those who use race as a power leverage, right? And I think that's what can fuel us to be the people who deliberately say, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to check myself and stop doing that. He does,
especially when you, I'm sorry, Janice, but I was going to say, especially when you realize that anyone that you deem beneath you is probably there because of racist policies and ideologies. It's not because you're such a great person. Sorry. It's not because you're better. It's because you've had a better opportunity, or you've got a higher hierarchy in things than most.
And it's your culture,
it's
like on Reset. It's
exactly.
Like, so he does go on, by the way, he digs into this whole relationship between African Americans and immigrants who are brown, because I think he uses it as a really powerful example of how we've fallen victim of this intention, right, of finding others who are lower. And interestingly enough, when you look back historically, you realize, we use that in this country, because we started putting out the data that showed, well, like, and you, Henri, you alluded to this, these brown immigrants are doing just fine. So it must mean we were right when we said African Americans are lazy and insolent and violent and all the things that we're going to get into next chapter with the body. But specifically, I want to share this. What he says is that when you actually look closely, we've ignored the studies that show, for example, that Black immigrants are on average the most educated group of immigrants in the United States. But they earn lower wages than similarly trained non-Black immigrants and have the highest unemployment rate of any immigrant group. So really, right, he says the ethnic racist would ask, why are Black immigrants doing better than African Americans? An ethnic anti-racist says, why are Black immigrants not doing so well as other immigrant groups? And again, like you said, all of this is camouflage to keep us from asking those questions, right? To keep us from digging deeper and figuring out what's actually at the root of this.
Well, another camouflage, so to speak, or it's funny, maybe camouflage isn't the right word, but going back to where are you from, and it's interesting because when he was talking about this, and I thought about it, like I said, so on my mom's side of family, we're from the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, St. Thomas, and I remember growing up with a distinct feeling you were different than American Blacks. And as I've gotten older, I realized that's about culture, and how you were raised, how you were taught to believe, what you were taught to value.
Yeah, of course.
Which wasn't making you so much different more than that's your culture. But, as I thought more about it, and he made reference in the book as he's engaging that student, well, where does that come from? And so you had to literally think about, we didn't start coming up with those differences that became promulgated and passed on generation to generation. It was the whites who developed those differences that we have then taken on and spirited and continue on our own.
Yeah.
As he said in that book, well, where did those thoughts come from? Where did those ideas come from?
Yeah.
And literally, as he dissects the story for this young man and takes them back, you go back to, well, this was all developed by whites who wanted you to hold on to those beliefs that cause you to feel differently about groups or even groups within your own, race.
Yeah.
And so, and I thought about it. And so, that's the interesting part, of where this began, how it's become embedded and how it just continues. And, this is a thought, I was online looking at something and they were doing a little quick demographic thing. I thought, oh, this is an interesting thought. And when they said race, this person was from Europe, of mixed race, and they called themselves ebony. And I said, oh, so that's the new term for Black?
Right.
This is a thought.
Yeah. That's, yeah. So I'm going to have to think a little bit more about that one. So the last piece that he takes us to, and then I'm going to ask you guys to be thinking about either a final comment or an action item, because we are going to leave folks with action items like we talked about when you think in terms of this idea of ethnicity and ethnic racism. But the last thing he does really point out that I think is really important is the notion of why we're comparing people who were born and raised here, regardless of their color, to people who immigrated here. Because he talks about the research, especially research centered around immigrant self-reflection. And what you find with people who immigrate is that they are often naturally more resilient and resourceful than people who haven't. And when you think about the circumstances that are in play often when people immigrate, and the things they have to go through and overcome in order to immigrate, that in and of itself, those characteristics about them, it's not about where they came from, because the research actually shows when you compare them to other people of their same socioeconomic status, et cetera, back in their home country, they're doing better than them. And that's because of those natural kind of characteristics of being exceptionally resilient, exceptionally resourceful. So he makes a really important argument about the lack of kind of value, if you will, to making comparisons between groups anyway, when you're looking at people who have immigrated here versus people who've been in this country or any country versus people who have been born and raised in a country. So that's, I think, a last kind of important piece of the learning for me from that chapter. So I'm going to go first to Henri and first to Melissa, and you can blend in your kind of final thought about this chapter and or, like I said, an action step for people to take away from. And then I'm going to just quickly introduce next episode and we'll wrap it up. Henri, what are you thinking?
Well, I guess if I would suggest one thing that just struck me, and it goes back to the really conscious effort one needs to make to change behavior.
Yep.
and like I said, and I think Melissa said this also, I mean, at least for myself, I don't even know when it began, how it began, more than there it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And to the point where it's unconscious, I mean, there are times you just do it without even thinking.
Exactly.
And how much of a conscious effort it really requires, for you to undo, those kind of things.
Yeah.
And how important that really is, if you want this to be different and change. The other thing I took away was this whole idea, because, as you may know, I'm a data person, and, give me the facts. And I like this idea that he talks about of really doing true comparison of similar groups. And this comparing groups that are not like,
right,
and then coming up with these conclusions, at sometimes merely supports, these false assumptions that we have about groups and populations.
Yeah.
And quote, as an example, compare immigrants to immigrants.
Yeah.
Compare poor to poor.
Exactly.
No group, one group. And I'll leave you with this, just to give you a great example real quick. So I'm on this community services board. We did a COVID study looking at what were the effects of the population dealing with the pandemic and shutdown and whatever. And some of the data slides were showing not a much difference between Black and everyone else. And then I said, as we were kind of doing some, discussion of the data, I said, who's in the everyone else group? Well, as it turns out, they grouped everyone else with whites, which, as we know, is a fair, percentage.
Okay.
With others. So everybody who fell out of, if you weren't Black, but you were other. So other could be, and because it was self-identified.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
Asian Pacific or something to that extent, which to me is different than being white, And I said, I would almost suggest if you redid the data and pulled out in the other group from whites, these others that you didn't want to group with Blacks, and maybe include them as a separate category, even though the N is going to be small, if you know what I mean,
of course.
Doing data analysis. I bet you will begin to see some difference, And so I just want to say that's what's so important that I think he was trying to get across in here, is when you want to quantify and make some, points,
right.
Why don't you really do the research or the analysis on similar groups so you really come up with a fair and equal analysis, so to speak.
And another way of thinking about how deliberate we have to be and why these voices are so important, to be the one in the group saying, hold on a second, maybe we need to look at it this way. All right, Melissa, what you got?
I think I'm going to sound like a broken record.
Do it.
It's because I can't help but reiterate that I think for me, it all comes back to education and learning. And by education, I don't mean having to go to college. I mean, self-educating, doing research, doing reading, getting clear on definitions. I know a lot of people may not even understand the difference between race and ethnicity.
Yep.
Because that's not a we don't distinguish between the two. So I think my action steps for people would be twofold. It would be, doing that work, doing that research, learning, educating. But Janice and I were speaking before we started recording, also about expanding your circle. As she's mentioned, we grew up in a pretty small town where we had Blacks and we had whites, and that was it. We didn't have different ethnicities. We didn't have people from, we didn't have Africans, we didn't have Asians, at least not in large enough numbers for them to be noticeable or, counted. And I'm not saying that they didn't exist, but it's not something that we were ever culturally aware of. So I try to make, and where I live now is no different. I see Blacks and I see whites. So I try to make a conscious effort to expand that circle. Thankfully, with social media, we have some access to other areas. It's not the same as in person by any means, but it's better than not at all. So I would recommend trying to get to know people. I think when we start to realize the differences, when, again, that broken record, when we start to accept and realize that we are not monoliths, no matter what.
Yep.
And we start to then look at the fact that there are a lot more similarities than there are differences in terms of character and, who we are, then, and we start to see, as Henri said, that a lot of the differences we keep attributing to things like race are actually because of culture. Yeah. I think that helps us get to this place of anti-racism, or at least makes the journey a little bit easier, because you're not grouping. You're not doing those unfair comparisons that Henri is talking about. So those would be my thoughts and my action steps. Is if you're going to say, if you're really trying to be anti-racist, as we've been saying, you have to be deliberate. You have to do it consciously, and you can't, forgive my language, but you can't half-ass it. You just can't.
No, that's exactly right. And I'm going to add 2 quick action items that are similar. One of them is, just think about one thing from this conversation, right? What's one thing from this conversation that really is leaving you wondering, and talk about it with somebody else, right? Somebody who didn't listen to this, or have somebody else listen to this, talk about it with that person and play it out for yourself a little bit. And then the second goes back to Henri's starting point, which is, given that we're in a world now where so much more is accessible to us virtually. Not everybody has access to that, but if you do, log in to your local school board meeting and just listen, right? Just one tiny little thing. Hop on a Zoom for and by the way, in a lot of places, they've been doing the live playing of school board meetings for a long time. That's not actually new with the pandemic in a lot of places, but log in and listen and just begin to get a sense of what's happening. So with that, you guys, next up, we're going to explore chapter 6, which is about the body. Kenny's going to help us better understand how the blatant misconceptions about the Black body have manifested into laws and policy that over and over again suggest that the Black body is dangerous. So that's going to be where we're going next. Henri?
Yeah, so next Saturday, I'm going to be downstate with Joshua at my grandson's birthday party. So I won't be available this time. I mean, if you want to do it the day after.
Actually, hold on for one. Hold that thought for 1 second, because I'm going to wrap us up and then we'll chat about
I'm
that.
sorry.
No, you're good. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear us talk about calendar, but we're going to wrap it up first. So that's where we're going next week. And of course, you guys, if you're listening, like, share, subscribe, do all the things that help create a bigger audience so that other folks can use this podcast, if you're doing nothing else, to foster your own learning, to be a part of the solution. Use this podcast for that purpose and share it with other folks in your life who for whom it would be beneficial. That's it. Join us next week and we'll get to it.